Okay, good. So we saw, last week, you guys saw that film by Jerry Coyne, who's at the University of Chicago. It was basically designed to show that, well, evolution is actually true. Very well documented. Of course, there's this big hullabaloo that supposedly a lot of religious people have trouble with evolution because they don't like the fact that we shared our most recent common ancestor with chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. Well, I want you to be a little bit empathetic and put yourselves in the chimpanzee's shoes. How do you think chimpanzees feel about sharing a most recent common ancestor with a bunch of crazy people? Okay? So, now, we didn't come from monkeys. We shared a most recent common ancestor. We're going to understand the difference. But the first thing I want to say about evolution by natural selection, now, natural selection can happen without evolution. But evolution by natural selection that is actually adaptive, in other words, traits that increase an organism's fitness in an environment, can only happen with natural selection. And then it's actually like a mathematical algorithm that iterative. It goes on and on and on each generation. Okay. Now, most human beings are generally concerned about two things: dying, right? Who in here isn't afraid of dying? Anybody? Good, good for you. Okay. How come you're not afraid? Okay. It's inevitable, yeah. Well, we'll see what happens when you get older and older. Yeah. But I agree with you. I think it's a raw deal, and so to hell with them. I didn't sign up for that. Right? And then, of course, another thing that most human beings are obsessed about is sex. So evolution by natural selection is basically sex and death. The same thing that human beings in general are obsessed with at one point or another in their lives is the same thing that evolution is about. So the stuff that you're going to be learning, everything that you see in nature is you'll find in human society. The same forces that are going on: competition, sexual selection, all kinds of things like that. Now, the only difference between evolutionary biology and human society, and the things that you're worried about, is that evolutionary biology studies it, whereas you guys actually live it. You have street cred. You're confronted with this all the time. Now, you're all young, so the death part seems like way in the future. But the sex part right now is like, oh, that's big, right? Okay. And what did I say that? Yeah, anybody who gets pregnant by the end of the semester, they get an automatic A, right? Okay. Just want to make sure you understand that. Because I want you to have fitness, evolutionary fitness, and the only way you get it is to create lots of offspring, right? I mean, that's it. That's the name of the game, isn't it? I guess. Okay. Okay. So, what's evolution to you?
Throughout thousands, like a long time, a certain group, like a certain organism, changes.
Changes. Okay, good. So, a lineage or a population of organisms change over time. Individuals don't change over time. Individuals are affected by natural selection. So if an individual has a trait that increases its fitness, it will leave more offspring, and those offspring with that trait will leave more offspring, and in future generations, over a very long period of time, most of the population will then be descendants of those that survived well, and they will make up the majority of the new population in the future. Okay, so that's a great definition. Now, we're going to look at it from the perspective of alleles. And you're going to think, what is an allele? Well, you guys know about DNA. DNA, in a lot of cases, comes in different varieties. Genes. So DNA makes up genes that code for proteins. They don't code for traits. They code for proteins that are then translated into traits. So it's not like you have a gene for, let's say, height, or for making the hormone insulin, or what. Insulin is actually a protein. So now, the thing is, genes come in different flavors. That's why there's variation in here. There are people in here of different heights, different eye color. Let's see, whether your earlobe is attached or not, those are dominant versus recessive traits. Dominant, we'll get to that in a bit, but to explain why that is. But these different versions of genes or flavors are called alleles. A-L-L-E-L-E. And in some cases, there can be thousands of different alleles. Now, each of you only have, at the most, 2. Primarily because we're diploid organisms, which means that we've received all our DNA, all the chromosome copies, one from our mother and one from our father. And so when they come together, they create a living organism. It's called a zygote, and then that organism, that zygote replicates itself under a bunch of different instructions on how human beings develop. And that development is in conjunction with the environment that it's in. So, of course, a zygote is inside the womb of its mother. And that's a very stable environment, but it's not exactly the same among all people, because there might be differences, first of all, in alleles, and also in the environment the actual mother lives in terms of, let's say, food security or things like that. So, change in traits or genetic characteristics, those are alleles of a population through time. And there's certain things that you have to meet for that to happen, including whether those traits or those genes are heritable. That means, do you inherit them from your parents? Okay. Okay, so descent from what? Descent from a common ancestor. What's the cause of this modification? Well, we call it natural selection, which is really, I think, a bad term. It's confusing because it implies that something or someone is selecting something, and it's not that way at all. It's the environment that either favors certain traits or disfavors others. And then, are you identical to your parents? We're going to look at this in the next slide. Yes?
Couldn't you just say that nature is selecting then? When you're
But
saying,
what is nature?
well, like the environment, you said the environment, but
Yeah.
the natural selection.
But is nature a real thing? I mean, nature is, we call it nature. We kind of imply that it's a real thing, but it's not a real thing that's selecting.
I think what you're saying, yeah, selection involves consciousness and
Yeah.
nature is anatomy.
Yeah, so, I mean, evolution by natural selection has nothing to do with consciousness whatsoever. It's like nature doesn't know what it's doing. I mean, you bring up a great point, okay? One of the things that people often do when you read about evolution is they imply that there's kind of choice going on. And it has nothing to do with choice whatsoever. It has to do with certain traits are favored, and they increase in future populations, and other traits are disfavored. Okay? So, but you bring up a great point. Now, a lot of people say, okay, nature, yes.
I have a question. Do you think doctors are kind of messing with evolution, maybe?
Everything that we do is messing with evolution.
Because what I was thinking is like, let's say you were born with a longer neck
Yeah.
for some reason,
Okay?
and then doctors for some reason they don't think that's normal, so they try to trim it down where you have a neck
Yeah.
like the rest
Right,
of
in
the
other
body.
words, yeah. Okay. Well, certainly modern medicine has had a strong effect in modern societies like the United States and Europe and in East Asia. Okay? In other places, modern medicine has still had an effect, but not as much because people are poor. They don't really have access to modern medicine and modern drugs. Okay? So what's happened for us in our modern society is selection has actually been relaxed in terms of things that would normally kill us. So we don't die now, normally, from a lot of infectious diseases, right? We have vaccines. Of course, there's this controversy, and there's people like Donald Trump who are still leading people astray, and that's going to have a huge negative effect on the population. But we have all these kinds of vaccines and therapies and all that will cure things. Yes?
Is there a point when a species will stop evolving?
No.
They can't stop evolving.
No. It's continual. So we say there's selection has been relaxed, let's say, on infectious diseases that normally kill us. Well, that just means that those alleles that would normally be there to protect us aren't really favored anymore, and they'll, but we're still evolving. Okay. Now, there are certain things, of course, that kill us now that didn't used to kill us in the past. One of them is buses. Right? A bus, if you step in front of it, it'll probably kill you, or it'll heavily change your phenotype. A phenotype is what an organism is, including its anatomy, physiology, behavior, development. Everything about an organism is called its phenotype. And if you step in front of a bus and you survive, your phenotype will be severely changed, and probably not for the better. Okay. Now you say, okay, but is a bus natural? Anybody in here think a bus is natural? Anybody in here not think a bus is natural? Okay. Why?
Well, because we made it.
Yeah.
We invented it, and it's produced in a factory. It doesn't exist, doesn't reproduce.
Okay.
Oh, it's not.
But then how come we have so many buses? Don't they reproduce?
No.
We reproduce them
Just
though.
before, they're
Okay.
not related to each other.
Yeah. Oh, actually, they are. Just think about it. Well, look at the bottom. Is evolution restricted to biological populations? Okay? I want you to think about that for a while. Yes?
I think that idea comes from the thought that humans are special because if a bird creates a nest,
Mm-hmm.
it's considered natural even though the bird made it. But anything man-made, some people consider unnatural.
In other words, we're apart from nature.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we're not apart from nature. We're animals. Whoop, 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 whoop. Right? We're animals, actually. Every single one of you is an animal. Now, some of you are more in touch with your animal nature than others. I'm very in touch with my animal nature. Okay? I mean, I get a desire in my head and I go right after it. It's just, I can't help myself. It's just amazing. But we're actually animals. Now, we say, okay, is a bus natural? And you say, no, a bus isn't natural, because we made it. You pointed out that a bird made a nest, right? Bees make hives. Okay, this is actually called, what something is called an extended phenotype. So I talked to you about a phenotype, about everything that makes up what an organism is, including, obviously, its genetics, all the cells in its body, anatomy, physiology, how they interact, all the proteins that affect cellular regulation, like hormones. Behavior is part of an organism. You may think, oh, behavior is different because we actually think about what we're going to do. Well, I'll tell you, from my perspective as being an animal, I often don't think what I'm going to do, I just do it. Okay? Which often gets me in trouble, as you can imagine. Now, you think that probably that you make choices, and you do, certainly. You're all here, supposedly to learn something, but there's a lot of stuff going on that you're not making choices about, or conscious choices, we'll say. Why do you find certain people, in terms of sex and relationships, why do you find certain people attractive and not others? Okay? Now, there's a lot, it turns out there's a lot of chemistry going on underneath that you're not even aware of, including smell. I mean, obviously, you can smell some people more strongly than others if they haven't taken a bath. But there's all these unconscious chemicals that you're actually smelling that might, in fact, have an effect on who you find attractive or not. Okay, but back to, is evolution restricted to biological organisms? Well, there's something called cultural evolution. Cultural evolution involves ideas and perhaps things that we actually make. So we go back to this bus. The first bus that was made, do you think the buses today are related to it in any way?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. In fact, buses have actually evolved. They've gotten better. First of all, technology has evolved. Mm-hmm. So, and technology, if we find, like, if someone invents something new that's better, then it gets incorporated into this new bus. Now, of course, you're saying someone came along and invented something, but usually new technology is built on old technology. In other words, it has a common ancestor. So we have these things, instead of having genes, we have something called, well, it's been coined memes, memory genes, or that actually affect cultural evolution. Other organisms have cultural evolution too. especially organisms that form groups and live in groups. So we're social animals, and there are other organisms that are social animals that learn some. Let's say there's these Japanese macaque monkeys, and it turns out monkeys and other organisms use tools or use things and change their environment, manipulate their environment. Well, it was shown there was this one troop that lived by the seashore, and a mother developed this thing where she would find something to eat, and then she'd actually wash it off instead of eating sand. Now, this is not an innate behavior. In fact, it had never been seen before whatsoever. Well, she taught it to her offspring, and they started doing it as well. Now, remember, this isn't genetic because she's teaching it to her offspring, but it's cultural. And, in fact, other members of the troop started copying that as well, and suddenly most members of the troop now wash their food in water. And they pass it on to their offspring. Not genetically, but just from memory and learning. So this new behavior has actually been passed on just like genetic traits do. But it has nothing to do with genes whatsoever. Except in the sense that these monkeys have an ability to learn, they have a brain, and there are substrates that allow it to form memories and act on those memories. Okay? So, cultural evolution, in fact, everything around us usually involves cultural evolution. Some of the stuff that we learn is hooey, or some of the beliefs that we have is this crazy stuff. But for the most part, we do like science. When we mentioned it before about about the scientific method, we do science naturally. We have an observation. We wonder why it's that way. It's usually something practical, like what's the best route to take to school in terms of time. And then we learn that, and then we probably pass it on to others, or we find out that what was actually taught to us was wrong, that there were other routes that are even better. So there's legacy. That means things that we've, ideas we've inherited from the past, and then there's new ideas that come up all the time. Okay. So this bus business, or cars have actually, and buses have actually evolved. They didn't exist until recently, of course. I mean, I think probably the 1880s or 90s, so 20-something years. Before that, there weren't any. There were carriages. You could say that cars actually evolved, let's say, from carriages pulled by horses, but in terms of a combustion engine and all that, it's relatively recent. And they didn't know what they were doing in the beginning, but they were experimenting, and that's what human beings do. Those are new ideas. Some ideas work better than others. There's also selection going on. Let's go to cars specifically. Who in here would rather have a Lamborghini than a Chevy Malibu or something like that? Anybody you'd rather have a Lamborghini?
Yeah.
Okay. Why?
Far more expensive. Sell it. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
It was built better.
What?
It was built better?
Well, it's built with traits that we'll say like, in terms of maintenance, it's probably a lot more expensive to run.
Well, that's because of better material being put into the car, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but if you want, let's say you buy a car because you want something that's reliable, doesn't go into the shop, and gets great gas mileage,
Prius.
you will not be buying a Lamborghini. Okay? It's just not going to happen. You may steal a Lamborghini and have a great time with it, and then drop it off somewhere. But I doubt you're actually going to buy a Lamborghini unless you have the money and you don't mind bringing it into the shop often for maintenance and things like that, because they're very touchy cars. Okay? Now, but those are traits. Those Lamborghinis have traits that are slightly different than other cars do. Let's say a small Chevy or something, or a Camry, right? Now, Camrys are very reliable for the most part. You have to take them in for maintenance, but not the same as a Lamborghini. They get much better gas mileage, especially if they're a hybrid or something. And so a lot of people buy, now this is actually interesting, they're actually selecting. They're saying, oh, why do I buy this car? Oh, I've heard great things about it. It has these sort of traits in terms of the expense that it takes to actually maintain it and how much gas it uses. But there's other people that don't worry about that. They have a lot of money, like Donald Trump. So he doesn't, well, he doesn't even, does he even drive his own car? No, that's too bad because it's fun to drive a Lamborghini. He's missing out. Okay, so there's selection going on there. In fact, cars that are really successful, you might say, they have traits that appeal to a lot of different people, and a lot of those people buy them. And then there's other cars that fall flat on their face. So the Chevy Volt was supposedly going to be a game changer. Okay? It wasn't. Well, no one really, I mean, GM has a terrible reputation, and most people, think, why would I want to buy a GM car? But some of you might have them, and they're good. I only had one, and it was terribly bad luck and poorly made. But so it's affected my choices ever since. So selection actually, in fact, that's why there's marketing. Marketing is designed to help you select someone's product, to manipulate you so you think, this is the car I want. Whether it's sexy or gas mileage, whatever it is, it has traits. And some of those traits, of course, like a Camry, usually, or any Toyota for that matter, often you don't need a new engine, usually for at least 150,000 miles, and sometimes 200,000 or more. Okay, this is great. You wonder how they sell enough cars when they're so reliable, but they apparently do because people like them. And then, you hear about other cars where, well, they're not all that reliable. So what happens with those cars? Do they get sold? No. Eventually, they might go extinct. People don't buy them anymore. They say, why do I want to have this piece of, crap? It's unreliable. It looks stupid. Doesn't go fast. Has terrible gas mileage. And it's likely to kill you, let's say, like a GM car. You can see I don't like GM cars. This goes back to the mid-'80s when I actually bought a GM, it was an SUV, what it was called. What's the small SUV?
Trailblazer.
What?
Chevy Trailblazer.
Yeah, exactly. I bought it. The throwout bearing for the clutch kept going out. I ended up putting 6 new throwout bearings. It was all covered by by warranty. Okay, and then eventually, when the car was just out of warranty, the intake manifold blew out, and all the coolant was sucked into my crankcase and ruined the engine. And of course, I talked to someone, and they said, "Well, it's out of warranty." So I said, eventually, obviously, nothing came of it. Well, I sold it. But I also told the guy, you know, I'm going to go around and tell people how bad GM cars are. And as you can see, I'm still doing it. Right? They're crap. Now, maybe they've gotten better, but of course, this whole business with faulty switches has killed a lot of people too, so they really haven't gotten all that better. But that's just me. You may have a GM car or a Chevy, whatever it is, and you're perfectly happy with it. That's great. But you can see how, in this case, there's selection on it. We'll say, okay, maybe it's not natural selection, but it actually is. It's the same process. The only difference is with natural selection, usually it's from one generation to the next. In terms of selection for cultural evolution, it can be horizontal as well, from one person to the next, because they share ideas. Yes?
I have a question about pandas.
Yeah.
So they're pretty much like useless creatures. Like the only thing you eat is bamboo, and it's not very good for them. They they're kind of lazy, and if it wasn't for us putting them in zoos, they would probably go extinct.
Yeah. Well, let's say we weren't around. Obviously, if you think that, I mean, why don't they just go extinct, right? Well, they didn't go extinct, so they must actually be fairly efficient at living and producing offspring. Now, of course, the only reason they're doing not so good now is because they're interacting with other species, namely us. And that interaction affects their fitness in a very negative way. And so, if we didn't have let's say, a captive breeding program or anything like that, they would probably go extinct. And because we'd be a selective force on them. The things that we do would have a negative impact on them, and eventually they'd go, beep, and they're gone. Now, there's all sorts of species that are going extinct today. There's always going to be something called background extinction, like a level of extinction where, you know, organisms wink out because they're very few in number or something like that, just naturally. There's also new species being created all the time as well. Now, at this point, we're above background extinction going on. Human beings have actually, well, we're a pretty strong selective force. You may not think that we're, let's say, as strong a selective force as the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Now that was a strong selective force, but we actually over time might have the same effect on the environment in terms of wiping out lineages. But it's not the end of the world, because those lineages eventually can give rise to new lineages, especially if we humans manage to change, or we kill all ourselves or something like that. Yeah.
You mentioned extended phenotype, but I didn't catch the definition.
Okay, so bees, honeybees, now they're all related to each other, highly related to each other. They all make what's called a hive. That hive is actually part of being a honeybee. They make their own environment. We make our own environments too. We affect our environment. In many cases, we really change our environment. And the environment that we create supposedly helps us survive and reproduce better. So this environment here is part of our extended phenotype. Not necessarily of an individual, but since we're a social species like bees, the whole social group, you might say, is kind of like a supraorganism. Okay. So let's move on. Okay, we already went over this in the movie. Change in populations or higher taxa through time. Order, so we've actually documented this. Order in the origination and extinction of taxa in the fossil record. Taxa can be any group, whether it's a species, a family of organisms, let's say the dog family, a phylum, a domain. Transitional forms. That means, have we found forms that are transitional between one form and another? Absolutely. Archaeopteryx, the bird, the quasi-bird, it looks like it was able to fly, but it had teeth and a long tail. And we've also found dinosaurs that weren't able to fly, but still had feathers, and many of those shared characteristics. Homology, that means traits that are actually inherited from a common ancestor. That's called homology. So, we are all inherited our forelimbs as tetrapods from a common ancestor that was, let's say, probably the first amphibian, or the beginnings of that, which was this, there was a fish, a lineage of fish that started, they lived in estuaries, very shallow water. They were able, selection favored some of their fins that actually started changing where they can actually start to walk on them. Eventually those gave rise to what are called tetrapods, vertebrate tetrapods. So they're all vertebrates. They all have four limbs, even the ones that lost them, like whales and snakes. And even though our limbs, if you look at them, they look different. They're the same bones are used continually. They're just changed over time. So a bird has four limbs. The same bones that are actually in our hands are in their bones in the wings as well. And you can actually show those. Okay. Vestigial traits. Those are traits that are no longer useful. Like Jerry Coyne showed with whales that have these remaining small, they're hidden now, but you can see in their skeleton they still have legs, or the remainders of legs. And then their front flippers are actually from their arms. So they've been modified heavily, but the same bones are there actually. So vestigial traits are traits that are no longer used, or that haven't been gotten rid of. Like, why do we choke? A lot of people choke, and you think, wouldn't selection have gotten rid of that? Well, it's pretty much bad design. So when people say, oh, there's an intelligent designer, not so much. An intelligent designer would have never had two openings in the same place that could get crossed up. Namely, we swallow and we breathe. Okay, that's all because far, far in the past, hundreds of millions of years ago, our ancestor was a fish with a swim bladder that helped it move up and down in the water column. Well, eventually, some of those individuals also used the swim bladder as a way to very inefficiently take in oxygen, kind of like a lung. And then over time, especially for all the organisms that then came onto land or evolved on land, they had lungs, and those got better and better. But unfortunately, the lung and the trachea evolved in tandem with with how organisms swallow. And so this is a holdover from the past that wasn't, an engineer would never, they would have dedicated different things, different pathways, esophagus and trachea, where they never came into contact. But we're not actually very well designed because evolution uses what's available. Okay. Descent from common ancestry. That means common ancestry is what taxa, at any taxonomic level, from population, species, genus, family, whatever. So, what taxa evolved from previous taxa? And then common ancestry determine where related taxa will be found. So why does Australia have so many marsupials and we don't? Well, it has to do with plate tectonics and when Australia itself split off from this thing called Gondwanaland many years ago. And then there's new species formation. Okay. Evolution by natural selection. On the left is Darwin, on the right is Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin, you're all familiar with. Wallace, probably not so much. Darwin went on a Beagle trip, as we'll see, around the world when he was a young fella, well before he came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection, as a kind of a naturalist on an exploratory ship, the Beagle. They came back, I guess they were gone for 3 or 4 years, something like that. He was part of the landed gentry. That means he didn't have to work or do anything. He came from a family that had land back then, so he was part of the upper class. In fact, he was a gentleman, and gentlemen, it was assumed, really didn't work, but they usually had things that they still worked on. A lot of them turned into vicars for some reason, I don't know why, you know, members of the Anglican Church. But, and he was even going to become a vicar, but that's besides the point. Wallace actually came up with the same ideas as Darwin, but about, 20 years later, a generation. He grew up poor, and he actually made his living by traveling around and collecting specimens, natural specimens from all over the world, and sending them back to people in Darwin's class. Okay, so he came up with the same ideas. Let's see here. Okay. There were 2 great ideas that both of them came up with. Now, Darwin didn't publish. He wrote some papers that he kind of shared with his fellows at the Royal Society, but he never really published anything until Wallace, who he was in touch with, actually sent him a manuscript that reiterated some of the same ideas as Darwin, and at that time, both of those papers were presented at the Royal Society. So the 2 great ideas, one was a process, evolution by natural selection. Now, natural selection is different than evolution by natural selection. As I mentioned before, you can have natural selection that doesn't cause evolution whatsoever. The meteor that came along and wiped out the dinosaurs, there were no traits that organisms had that would make them more likely to survive than other traits. It's just pretty much blind luck whether certain lineages survived or not. Yes?
Didn't burrowing animals survive more because they were able to
Well,
escape?
so I guess you're right. There was, instead of individual traits, an organism having individual traits that selection act on, there were populations or species that had traits that made it more likely they would survive or not. So let's say being a burrowing animal was probably would lead more likely that they would survive. Or birds are dinosaurs. They're related to theropod dinosaurs. Birds can fly. Perhaps being able to fly allowed them to escape and then survive long enough until the atmosphere, more light came in and things started to grow again. Okay? But in general, individuals we don't have traits that protect us from asteroids. Okay? Do you think we have traits that protect us from buses?
Sure.
Yeah.
What?
Fears.
What?
Certain fears.
Fear?
Reflex.
Reflexes? Okay? Huh? Sight? Good. But we don't have big, eventually we might have humans that, let's say there's a lineage that's big human beings, and eventually over time there's selection for like bony plates that protect them from buses. Unlikely. For the most part, our evolution has become behavioral, right? Some people are less, are more prone to risky behavior and not thinking than others. And those individuals that are not apt to just step in front of anything that they step into are more likely to leave more offspring than people who are unaware of their surroundings and kind of wander in to traffic, whether that's because they drink too much or whatever. Okay? Now, asteroids don't come along very often. So there's selection there, certainly about which individuals survive, but it's pretty much random which individuals actually survive and which don't. Okay? Now, that's evolution by natural selection, and then the other great idea, of course, is that descent from a common ancestor. So it turns out, and it looks like this, there could be other forms of life that we don't recognize as life on this planet. But in terms of the life that we do recognize, all that life is actually related to a single most recent common ancestor from 3.5 billion years ago or more. Because we use the same genetic code. Exactly the same genetic code. Make the same amino acids. The same proteins. They get modified over time, how those are made. Sometimes new genes evolve from old ones. New proteins evolve. But they always come from a previous ancestor. Okay. So this is the last paragraph on the origin of the species. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It almost sounds spiritual. It's certainly the wonder and the beauty is what strikes me the most about life on this planet and living in this universe. Okay, so we're talking about natural selection. New variants, that means new mutations, that means new alleles, evolved because of mistakes in copying. Most of those mutations either have very little effect on the organism or they have a deleterious effect, a bad effect. Namely, if your genes are designed to make a certain protein, and you substitute one amino acid in the protein for another, most likely it's not going to make the protein function any better than it did in the past. In fact, it's probably going to make it function worse, and sometimes not function at all. Okay, so, and then over time, old variants or old alleles might change and go to extinction because the environment has changed. Now, these alleles, of course, get turned into traits. So I'll give you an example. We'll say wolves. Wolves in gray wolves, the ones that we see all across North America and Eurasia, are all related to each other. Their fur length varies depending on where they live. Obviously, you would suspect that having dense or fur density and length would be less dense the further south that these animals live, because having a heavy fur coat in a hot climate is probably, you'd be miserable, and you probably wouldn't produce very many offspring. Versus going into farther north into the Arctic, having a long fur coat would be advantageous. Now, it doesn't mean that wolves are deciding, oh, I need a long fur coat. It just means that there's variation in the density of the fur and the length of the fur. In other words, they're not all identical. If they're identical, they wouldn't be able to evolve whatsoever. The climate changes, as it's actually changing now. It gets warmer. What do you think will happen to the population of wolves that are further south? Will they get thicker coats or thinner coats?
Thinner.
Thinner. Okay. What about the ones up north? In cold climate. Thinner? Exactly. So now you might say, well, okay, thinner is better. But what happens if, let's say, 500,000 years into the future, something happens that causes the world to cool down again? Will thicker coats or thinner coats be more favored? Thicker. Okay. So you can see that traits, there's not one trait in terms of coat length and density that is perfect. It changes depending on the environment and how that environment affects individuals. So that's evolution by natural selection. That's an environment that's actually, we'll say the environment, like you said, nature, is selecting, but selecting is a really bad word because it implies consciousness in many cases, and it has nothing to do with consciousness. Even human beings who we think we select things. We decide who we're going to marry, who's going to be our friend. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath that we're not aware of whatsoever. It's all involved with chemistry. We think we make decisions, but and we do, but not necessarily as much as we actually think we do in terms of what we do. Now, okay. So there's a couple of things we want to concentrate on. Mutations. Mutations happen at the cellular level in the DNA of an individual. The alleles that certain individuals have that are translated into traits for the whole organism whether it's a single cell organism or not, are affected by the selective environment that they're in, or the environment that they're in. Some of those alleles that come into being are due to mutations in the DNA. Most mutations have either no or very little effect or negative effect because of the change that they make in proteins. A population is a group of those organisms down here. They make up a group that are all similar. They share the same most recent common ancestor. They all have the same genes, but they have different variations of those genes. And because of the selection that's going on individuals, the population changes over time in terms of the alleles that are found in the population. Certain alleles have higher fitness than others. Yes?
At what point do the people who are making the taxa determine that something's just like a variation allele or it's a totally different species?
Okay. Well, do you think a species is the same thing, as real as H2O, water? Okay, so water. We know what water is, right? It's two hydrogens and then an oxygen. It's something that objectively we can say, oh, that's real. It may come in different forms, snow, liquid, gas, but we know because of the science that we've done that water is made up of 2 molecules of hydrogen, 1 of oxygen. There's some variation in isotopes, but forget about that for now. Do you think species are as real as H2O? In other words, there comes a certain point where a different population of this species changes enough to become a new species. Hmm?
Yes, right.
Okay, yes. So there's got to be a certain point in time where, boop, I'm a species. Okay. Now, when I take, let's say, a string, a long string, and I cut it up and I say, oh, here's a short piece, here's a medium piece, and here's a long piece. Are those objectively real things?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Are they?
Well, I mean, relative
Small,
to each other.
medium, large?
Well, it's relative to each other.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But is it like H2O?
No.
No. It's arbitrary, in fact, in terms of how we group things in a lot of cases. So, in terms of categorization, things that we do, are those groups actually real? A lot of them aren't real, as you would say in terms of, let's say, H2O. Now, the question is about species. They're not like either of those. They're neither arbitrary, completely arbitrary, nor are they completely objectively real. Primarily because species evolve. In other words, they change over time. And evolution or speciation is a process that changes over time, not all of a sudden going, boop, I'm a new species. And so it's kind of, it's semi-real, we'll say, compared to a group of different lengths of string, but it's not as real as H2O. And we'll see later, in terms of, there's a whole bunch of different definitions for what a species is, which kind of gives you an idea that it's not a real thing. It's a real thing in space and time, but not just in space. Okay. Now, in terms of individuals with different alleles in a population, individuals do not evolve. You're dealt the hand you're dealt with. If that hand is good, you leave more offspring. All these individuals make up a population. Those that have been dealt a good hand leave more offspring than others. And then old variants, or old alleles, that were maybe good in one environment but have now changed, the environment has changed, are no longer good, and they go extinct. That's called microevolution, and it happens at, we'll say, the population level. Now remember, this is important. Individuals do not evolve. Populations do. Except that I'm going to give you an example later where there's actually, you could say that either groups of individuals actually act like one organism, like bees. They're almost completely related to one another, identical, versus individuals where there's variation. But we'll get to that later. The main thing that I want to get across is populations evolve depending on the environment. Okay, so here we are with, these are fundamental concepts. What is an allele? It's a variant of a gene. It says alleles. In other words, there's two alleles because it's a diploid organism. We're actually looking at chickens. And a chicken at a certain locus, a certain gene, may have identical alleles that they got from their mother and their father, or they may have one allele A1, and the father might have donated allele A2, which is slightly different. Okay? And those alleles, of course, in terms of reproduction, are turned into gametes, whether they're eggs or sperm. Now, what is a gene pool? It's all these chickens, including their offspring, have alleles in them, and they form basically the gene pool. In fact, you could say, if you arbitrarily just looked at the different alleles found in the population, you could say, well, these are all the individual alleles. Now, gametes only have one version because they're haploid. That means they only have one chromosome and not two chromosomes like we have. So when the individual chromosomes, one that's been inherited from the mother, one that's been inherited from the father, come together, the diploid organism is restored, and then it turns, eventually develops into, let's say, a mature organism. So we have population, we have a gene pool. This is the gene pool, but this is the population from which the gene pool is derived. The frequency of these alleles, here it says there's 50% A1 in the population and 50% A2. That doesn't have to be that way. You could actually have A1 100% and there's no A2. You could have allele A1, there's 25% A1 and 75% A2. This depends on what the population is. Now, a genotype is the diploid form. That means this is haploid, a single chromosome with an allele on it. Genotypes are when the alleles have come together from male and female, from mother and father, and made a diploid organism, and these are the genotypes. And if we have two alleles in a population, this is a very simple model, very, very, very simple. You can actually have many, like in some loci, 1,000 different alleles. More. Doesn't mean that there have to be only 2. Individuals, though, that are diploid only have 2 alleles out of the whole population. But in this very simple model of with 2 loci, with 1 gene, but there's a change, and in one of them it's A1, and the other one is A2. And they form the following genotypes. You either you got an A1 from your mother, and you got an A1 from your father. Or you got an A2 from your mother, and an A2 from your father. Those are called homologs or homologous. We'll get to that more in the future. And then there's also individuals who got an A1 from their mother and an A2 from their father, or vice versa. And those are called heterozygotes. Hetero means different. So they got different alleles making up this gene. And that's what a genotype is. In this case, we see, starting from this proportion of A1 and A2, these are the frequencies that you would actually get from this number, this proportion of alleles. You would get 25% A1, A1, 25% A2, A2, and 50% A1, A2. And it's easy to show what that is. We'll get to it in a bit, because you can use something called a Punnett square, where you can actually see how it works that way. In fact, I think I'll show you. Okay. Just to get it in your heads. Okay. Up here is the male. Down here is the female. The male can have one allele or the other, so we'll say, we'll put A1 there and A2 there. And same for the female. A1, sorry, and A, come on, 2. Okay, A1 and A1. That means if the mother and the father, then you have a genotype. That's where each individual has 2 alleles. You both have A1, A1. If you go across, this individual has, the male has A2, then you have a heterozygote. We'll start with the male first, A2, and then the female, A1. Here we have A2. A1 starts first, A2, so we have A1, A2, and then A2, 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 A2. Okay? Now, it turns out these are heterozygotes. They're both the same. It's just that they got the different allele from either one parent or the other. Right? So, we'll say that because there's 2 of those, everything else, if all this other stuff adds up to 1, and you've got 4 different categories, then you can have, obviously, A1, A1,